Alright guys, this is the A-Push lecture notes for chapter 32 and 33 covering the Great Depression and the New Deal. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the origins of the Great Depression. And one of the main factors that comes to play in this is there is a general economic decline going on in America during this time period. And it's more or less a reaction to some of the excesses and things that we talked about during the Roaring Twenties. As far as the progression of it goes, in 1928, general stock prices begin to decline. Now, in a reaction to that, in 1929, Wall Street begins to attempt to prop up stock prices, in other words, to bring them back up with stock purchases. And we'll talk about in a few seconds how that leads to the stock market crash and all these things. Now, what this inflation of the stock market leads to is a bubble, and as we'll see going forward in the rest of the economic history of the United States, inevitably when there's a bubble, it's going to burst at some point. In the case of this, it happens on October 29th, 1929 with Black Tuesday, which was the most devastating day in the history of the stock market up to this point and since, and resulted in $30 billion lost on paper, and we'll look at the effects of that going forward. So now we're going to move on from the crash to the causes of it. And the first and probably most important one for our purposes is speculation, which we have talked about in the past with regards to railroads and land and other things. For the purposes of this, though, we're going to be looking at stocks. And basically what people are doing are gambling that they're going to be able to make a quick buck by buying stocks at a very low price and then basically flipping them in a relatively short period of time and selling them at a high price. We move from speculation to something called margins, which is basically a way for stockbroker or stock owners to buy more stock for less money. In other words, when you buy something on margin, you pay a fraction of the value of it, in this case stocks. The way it works is that you may pay like 5% or some kind of set value of the price of the stock, and the rest of it is covered by a stockbroker or other investor. To give you an example of this, let's say you have $500 and you want to buy shares in Walmart. All right. If the price of the stock is $100, you're able to buy 5 shares normally. So 5 shares times $100 equals $500. If you buy this stock on margin, you only have to pay $5 per share. So you're able to buy 100 shares with the stockbroker covering the rest of the price. The results of this are, if the price goes up on the stockbroker is very happy because he's going to get all of his money back, or at least he hopes to. But on the flip side, if prices begin to go down, the brokers will, in a lot of cases, call in the balance of the loan, which means you're responsible for the rest of the money, or you're responsible for paying the money that was loaned to you to buy this stock. This is something called a margin call, and it plays very importantly into the causes of the Depression and the cause of the stock market crash that led to it. So what ends up happening is we have a snowball effect, which leads to the stock market crash. The way that it went basically is that, first of all, the market became saturated. You have a lot of overinflated stock that is in the market. When this happened, brokers began to call in their margins, and because the investors had to borrow this money, they didn't have this cash on hand, so they're unable to pay the balance that they're due. When this happened, the brokers basically take over the stock and sell it to somebody else. And when this happens, it just starts training. It starts snowballing when other investors start selling their stock as well. What it leads to is a significant drop, or a drastic drop, in the stock market's overall value, to the point where at the beginning of the day we had millionaires on paper who, by the end of the day when the stock market crash happened, were basically beggars on the street. This graph that we're looking at here gives a pretty good indication of how volatile the stock market was during this time period. As you can see, Black Tuesday is marked in 1929, which was, as we know, the stock market crash. You can see that it comes down from a previous high on that day, basically a record high. And also another thing that you can figure out from looking at this is how volatile it was during the period of the Depression. It wasn't a steady decline the entire way to a bottom point. There were ups and downs along the way, and a lot of variations in the value of it, which speaks a lot to the instability of the economic condition of the United States during this time period. So now we move from the causes of the stock market crash to the proper causes of the Great Depression. There were basically 5 of these things. The first of all was a lack of diversification in the economy. Second was the misdistribution of purchasing power. 3 was the credit structure of the economy. 4, weakened trade position. And 5, the debt problem. So all of these had pretty much an equal effect on the causes of the Depression in this time period. First cause we're going to look at is the lack of diversification in the United States economy during this time period, and this is because of a couple of factors. The first one is the complete reliance on the automobile and the construction that came from that industry itself. I'm talking about things like roads and gas stations and all the things that we talked about in a previous chapter. What this ends up doing is eventually oversaturates the market, and it leads to a lack of demand. And when you have that, you have consumers that are not buying as much, and you're not able to sell inventory or do as much work as you previously could. And what it does is it leads to an even deeper decline in the economy, and in this case the stock market, than there was before. Lack of diversification basically means that you've got a small number of industries, or you're reliant on a very small number of industries to keep your economy going along. The second problem we have is a misdistribution of purchasing power. And basically what this is a cycle that runs through every economy. And what happens is you reach a high where people are producing so much stuff that there's not enough consumer demand to keep the industry going. In other words, people have bought all the stuff that they can. There's an oversaturation in the market. When this happens, businesses start to see their cycle decline. And when this happens, they start to lay people off. So it becomes kind of a circle of things going on in different industries. So you not only lead to a loss in the sale of products, you also lead to higher unemployment, which significantly affects the economy and contributed to the Depression. The next thing we've got is the credit structure of the economy, and basically what that means is we've got a lot of debt coming from a lot of places in this economy. First of all, farmers are looking at significant amounts of debt from the reasons we've talked about having to borrow money to put their crops in every year, and then the prices of those crops when they harvest them not keeping up with the prices they paid. So it leads to a perpetual cycle of debt. Second of all, when the bank failures begin to happen that we'll look at here in a little bit, it leads to more people not being able to pay stuff back, which leads to a worsening of the economy, and so on and so on and so on. Next thing we're looking at is a weakened trade position on a global scale. Now, it hadn't been brought up before, but the Great Depression was not only located in the United States, it was a worldwide global phenomenon and depression in and of itself. So when this stuff begins to happen overseas, what happens is the demand for American products drop as well. Because people in other countries just don't have the available money to buy products from over here. What this leads to is reactions with high tariffs and things like this that we'll look at. What this weakened trade position leads to is a rise in tariffs here in the United States. And the first place where it manifests itself is in the Forney-McCumber tariff law, which raised tariffs on incoming goods or imported goods from 27% to 35%. The result of this, number one, it begins to hurt Europe anymore, sliding them further into depression, mainly because of a combination of this plus the war debts that they had accrued during World War I. It also leads to a tariff war and oppression in Germany, which further heightens or weakens Germany's economic position, leading to the events we'll talk about in a couple of chapters with the rise of Hitler. Another tariff that comes on board during this time is the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930, which was the biggest peacetime tariff ever instituted by the United States. It took it further from 38.5% on imported goods to 60%. Basically what it does is it outrages or angers a lot of foreign nations, leads to trade wars because European nations saw this as a declaration of economic warfare by the United States. What it does is it further, like I talked about a while ago, pushes the rest of the world deeper into a worldwide recession, which eventually will lead to depression and the things in Germany that I spoke of earlier. The biggest problem that's happening with Europe's economy during this time is the fact that they're just unable to pay our war debts to us, and it's also contributing to the decline in our economy. They say we should write off our debt as war expense and just completely get it off the books because A, we didn't really sacrifice enough, which may or may not be a valid point because on the scale of casualties that occurred during World War I, ours was relatively or significantly low. Second of all, we've got these tariffs going on at this point, which is making it almost impossible for Europe to pay any debts or anything like that to us. And third, the borrowed money that European nations are looking at was borrowed from the United States. So some of the money that they fought World War I with came from us. The solution that we come up with is the Dawes Plan. So the way that the Dawes Plan works is pretty easy in theory, but it was a little bit harder to work out in practicality. Basically, the way it worked is that Wall Street bankers were going to pay private loans, or were going to loan money to Germany in order for them to pay their war reparations or the payments set up by the Treaty of Versailles to France and Great Britain. Once France and Great Britain got this money, they were then going to turn it around and pay it back to the United States, in effect wiping out their war debt. We move from the causes of the Depression to some of the general weaknesses in the economy. And first and foremost on this is the failures that occurred in our banking system. As you can see from this graph on the screen, there is a significant number of banks that collapsed or failed during this time period. And the reason for that is pretty simple. First of all, people were unable, because of the other weaknesses and problems we talked about, to pay back loans they got from these banks. When this happens, the bank has a significant shortage of cash on hand, and they're unable to A, make loans, or B, give people back money that they have, in theory, saved with the bank. Once this happens, the bank becomes what's called insolvent, and it's unable to keep its doors open, so they end up closing or failing. Now, what happens with this, once these banks start to fail, or when word gets out that banks are failing, people start to panic and go try to get their money out of their local bank. And it leads to something called a bank run, where people are just piling up trying to get their money that banks, in fact, do not have. So it leads to panic, it leads to instability, and it leads to a lot of problems in the economy. Our next weakness is a decline in the money supply, which leads to something called deflation, which is the opposite of the inflation that we talked about before. The results of this are pretty simple. When it happens, employers no longer have demand coming into their factories or companies to produce as much product, so they have to cut production. When they do this, they no longer have a need for the number of employees they have, so they begin to lay them off. The results for our purposes of this is that it leads to over a 25% unemployment rate during the Great Depression. We move from the causes of the Depression to the effects of the Depression on everyday people. And the first area of focus we're going to have is cities. And the biggest problem that people in major metropolitan areas faced was unemployment. We're talking in some places over 50% of the inhabitants or citizens of a city did not have a job. One of the most visible representatives of this is the picture that you see below, where some former businessmen who were relatively well-to-do were reduced to selling items on the street and basically being panhandlers. They sold things like apples and oranges and trinkets and what have you because they had no other option and no other opportunities because of the lack of employment in the cities. As a direct result of this unemployment, it became difficult for a lot of people in these cities to be able to feed themselves and their families. So in response to this, soup kitchens and bread lines, as you see in the pictures below, were set up in an effort to help these people out, to give them a couple of meals a day to at least keep them going. Now, we're not talking really extravagant soup kitchens or anything like this. We're talking like thin broth, black coffee, and in a lot of cases stale bread. So it's nothing like these people have been used to before. It's very, very, very hard times. Another result of the Depression in cities were the creation of Hoovervilles, or shanty towns as we're going to call them for these purposes. These were people who had no other choice really but to set up settlements outside or on the outskirts of cities, normally by people who didn't have jobs, who were what was called transients, or people who moved from place to place looking for work, as well as the unemployed. Basically, they took the materials they had on hand and they tried to build some kind of dwelling or some place to live to keep them out of the weather. Moving from cities to the country, really the biggest problem that was faced in the agricultural communities at this time was the significant drop in the prices that they were paid for their products, and it was partly because of the downward turn in the global market, as well as the debts that they accrued in trying to put their products in. The biggest result of this was foreclosures, in which the bank comes in and basically takes over your farm or takes it from you because you can't pay your bills. In response to this, something came about called penny auctions, which is pretty important for our purposes, and it's basically a stage sale of property in which your neighbors or your friends come in and buy the farm back for you for pennies on the dollar. In other words, they try to help you out to get your farm back without having to pay the highest price. So that's a basic sum up of the causes and effects of the Depression. Obviously, we'll handle some of this a lot more in-depthly in class, but for just general overview purposes, that's what you need to know. We move from there to the election of 1932 when FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, comes in and attempts to institute the New Deal, and that'll be the next focus for this next set of slides. So the election of 1932 was a pretty significant election because, as we've seen with all the things that we've looked at up to this point, things are not going very well at all in the United States. It's horrible conditions, and a lot of the American people think it's time to change the course. So the setup for it, we've got Herbert Hoover, who was a Republican, running against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a Democrat. The conditions we're looking at: tons of businesses closed, banks failing, jobless everywhere, upwards of 11 million people unemployed. So this is the choice that the American people are faced with. As you can see, the election itself, because of the conditions, was not even close. FDR picks up almost every state outside of a couple in the Northeast. Now, the electoral vote, not even close. Popular vote, a little more split because of the lack of population we have in the West at that time. So FDR comes in riding a pretty big wave of discontent against Herbert Hoover. So when he comes in, he feels like he has what's called a mandate, as you'll see in the next slide. And that's basically means that he feels like the American people have given him permission, or they approve of the course that he is going to take. In the case of this, we're talking about the New Deal. So he feels like he has permission to institute his policies in an attempt to end the Depression. So just kind of bottom line the results of the election in 1932. It is a complete rejection of the Republican Party and the policies that they put into effect to try to stem the Depression. FDR becomes president by a wide margin, as you've seen. Democrats win 2/3 of Senate seats and 3/4 of the seats in the House of Representatives. So when FDR comes in, he, like I said earlier, does feel like he has an extreme mandate to put in the policies he feels will end the Depression, and those policies are what we're going to look at going forward. First thing that FDR does after he's elected is start to kind of set up what he wants to do once he goes into office, because it was a little bit different back then than it is now. Back then in the 30s, the president was elected in November but did not take office to March. So there was about a 4-month period there where it was kind of a, if you want to call it lame duck or whatever, on the side of the president who was coming out of office, but you also had planning time for the man who was coming into office. So what FDR does is take advantage of his time by putting together something called the Brain Trust, which was a group of professors, lawyers, and journalists who were to advise on the programs that he wanted to put in an attempt to stem the Depression. They were also looking at, particularly from a legal standpoint, what programs he could put in legally, and try to figure out what role the federal government should play in ending the Depression. Because one of the big debates up to this point was, should it be up to the government to pull us out of this, or should it be up to private individuals, corporations, factories, etc.? So that's what he's doing with this Brain Trust, trying to figure out what they can do. His programs, when they come in, basically all the programs that we're going to talk about can be divided up into 3 different categories, which were known as the 3 R's back then, and they all fall into one of the 3: relief, recovery, or reform. And as we look at these, one of the judgments you're going to have to make is which of these categories these programs fall in. The first thing that FDR does when he comes into office is he tries to stem the bleeding of the banks. In other words, he's trying to keep as many of these from closing as have in the years previous. So he signed something called the Emergency Banking Relief Act in 1933, which basically gave him the power to regulate banks in an attempt to keep as many from closing as had. He also signs in the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, which does a couple of things to, once again, try to keep these banks from closing, to keep them solvent. The first thing it does is it creates the FDIC, which is basically insurance on the money you put into banks. Initially, during this time period, it's $5,000. So if you've got $5,000 in the bank, you're guaranteed, if this bank closed, to get your money back. Anything over $5,000, you're not guaranteed. Okay, today I think the level is something like $250,000 or something like that. One of the things that people do now in an attempt to not lose their money in case a bank goes under or something is to divide your assets or divide your money between banks. So one of the ways people could have further protected themselves during this time period is to put up to $5,000 in one bank, $5,000 in another one, etc., etc., etc. So if they closed, they'd get their money back. But it offered a layer of protection for the consumer when dealing with banks during this time. So the next thing we're going to try to figure out is, did Glass-Steagall work? And it's pretty evident from looking at this graph that it did, because we reach a high of bank failures in 1933, before Glass-Steagall was instituted, of 4,004 banks closing in this country. The year directly, or the year immediately after this act was signed into law, we dropped to a low of 57. So it's pretty evident from looking at this that Glass-Steagall did have a significant effect on the bank failure problem we were looking at during this time. The next section we're going to look at is unemployment during this time period, and whether the periods that FDR instituted really worked to drop unemployment. And an easy way to do this, leading off, is to look at this graph. A couple of things to point out in trends is the downturn in unemployment from the time of FDR's election to till the New Deal programs were instituted. Another one is the uptick in unemployment for a couple of years after the New Deal comes into effect. And lastly, and this is what we'll be focusing on at the end of the week, or at the end of the chapter, is whether World War II was the real defining factor in ending the Great Depression. Because as you can see, there's a very significant downturn in unemployment when World War II breaks out in Europe. So those will be the things that we're looking at and what you need to think about as we go through these programs. Did they really help? Were they temporary band-aids, or did they just not work at all? First program we're going to look at as far as New Deal programs is the Civilian Conservation Corps, in which FDR instituted work on a lot of environmental projects, such as reforestation, flood control, etc., in a way to just basically put people back to work. The way it basically worked, it was a lot of young men who were ages 18 to 25 who did these jobs, and they took a significant portion of their income and sent it home to their parents in an effort for them to A, save, and B, put the money back into the economy. A typical example of this was the workers made right around $30 per month, and they sent 25 of it home to their parents, to their wives, to whoever it was. Our next act that we're going to look at is the Federal Emergency Relief Act, which was set up for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was to maintain relief efforts. It was money that was given to states so they could pay out wages to the workers who were doing things such as the jobs in the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was made to keep work going, to keep people from being unemployed, and also to ensure a variety of relief programs. In other words, this thing was designed to just keep the ball rolling in an effort to build momentum in the economy, to get people back to work, and to try to help us grow out of the things that we had been in. The next program we're going to look at is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, in which the government is attempting to eliminate surpluses in the market, for example, soybeans, wheat, cattle, hogs, whatever it is, in an attempt to manipulate the market. They're trying to drive down the supply in order to raise prices. In other words, we're producing too much at this time, the prices are too low, so this is an attempt to raise prices to try to help farmers get out of debt. Key part for our terms is that it's later declared unconstitutional because of the government impact on the markets and things like that. The next one we're looking at is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was an attempt by the government to refinance mortgages on non-farm homes in an attempt to keep these people from being kicked out. In other words, they're not making enough money because they're unemployed or for other reasons to pay their home mortgages. So they're trying to lower interest rates, they're trying to drop their payments in an attempt to keep them from getting kicked out of their homes. Next is the Civil Works Administration. A little background on it. These are people who worked on public works projects. In other words, things to improve the things around cities. There were a lot of critics of this who said the work wasn't worth the expense. In other words, you're overpaying them for the jobs that they're doing. The reason it was so expensive and we were spending so much money on it was because of the scope of it. There were over 4 million people working under this program, and they were giving them high wages for work that wasn't worth the money that they were paying. It was basically temporary employment. It was considered by some to be busy work, and it only lasted 1 year because of the pressure and because of the scrutiny it came under for the amount of money that was going into it. One of the things that comes out of these programs is obviously when anybody does anything, there's going to be critics of what you're trying to do. And one of the loudest during this time period was a guy named Huey P. Long, who was the governor of Louisiana during this time period. He believed the New Deal, and he's a little bit different than the critics of it today in that he thought that it wasn't doing enough. It wasn't helping enough people in a great of enough way. So he came up with his own program called the Share Our Wealth program, in which he promised $5,000 for every family in America to spend how they saw fit. In other words, instead of giving jobs or anything like that, you just cut them a check and let that money come back into the economy. Another critic of the New Deal was Father Charles Coughlin, who, as you can see, was a preacher. His appeal came from the fact that he had the benefit of radio to reach a mass audience. And he was first a supporter of the New Deal and later became a critic because, once again, he didn't feel like it was doing enough. His proposal was to basically write a check for $200 a month for the elderly that they had to spend during that designated time period. You didn't get to keep the money, you didn't get to save it, you had to put it back into the economy by making payments, by buying goods, by all of that stuff. And that was his proposal, or his way to try to pull us out of the Depression. Moving back to the programs, the first one is the Works Progress Administration, which was the largest New Deal program and spent over $11 billion on public buildings, parks, bridges, and roads. It created more than $9 million in 8 years. And along with the things that came about with the jobs, it also had very significant art programs in that it gave funds for artists to create murals, actors, writers, etc. So it was probably the most wide-ranging of the programs that we talked about so far in the effect of the kinds of jobs it created and the kinds of things that it created people to do. Next was the National Recovery Administration, which was basically to help out industry or factories or corporations, the people who worked for them and the unemployed. When it came to the factor of industry, it set up fair competition. All right. So it basically capped the number of hours that people could work a week. It gave a wage floor or a bottom level, basically a minimum wage that people could work for and things like that. From the labor standpoint, it gave them a right to organize, which was very important and a way to address some of the things we've talked about in the past as far as worker exploitation and the conditions that they worked under. Next is the Public Works Administration, which basically gave money to federal contractors for the creation of public works like highways, buildings, parkways, green spaces, all of these things that in effect are meant to benefit the common good, to benefit the community. All right, so it was a way to help industry and the unemployed, and yet another program in the many that we have talked about. Another challenge, or another thing that FDR had to do as a component of the New Deal, was to go to war or to battle bankers. Now, what he's trying to do is prevent another stock market crash from happening. In other words, put in some kind of regulations or some kind of things that will keep this from occurring again. The first one is the Truth in Securities Act, which basically deals with stock transparency. In other words, you have to be pretty open with the paperwork you have as far as your prices, as far as your conditions, dealing with every component of going into the stock market. Another agency that was set up under the New Deal was the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, still a fairly big watchdog of Wall Street today. It was set up back then in an effort to ensure that the stock market crash, or that a stock market crash, would not happen again, as well as protecting stockholders and things like that. Wrapping this up, the last New Deal program we'll look at is the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority. Pretty significant around here because of the electrical components and the wetlands and the projects that were set up under it during this time. Now, though the TVA was very successful during its time period and still fairly successful today, it was criticized as socialism for the things that it did. And those things were as follows. First of all, it put a lot of people to work, building dams, setting up electrical grids, building recreation areas, and so forth and so forth. It was also tasked with flood control and cheap power because of the TVA during this time period, a lot of rural areas in the South got electric power that did not have it before. Another thing that FDR set up during as part of the New Deal was Social Security, which is a hot button issue even today. It was set up by the Social Security Act of 1935, and it was introduced or induced to do the following things. It set up a system of unemployment insurance. It set up old age pensions. It was financed by payroll taxes back during this time period, and once again criticized as socialism. So we moved from all of these programs and areas to the election of 1936, where, as you can see from the map, FDR did not really have a lot of problem winning this election. In fact, he won it by a wider margin than he did the election of 1932, picking up a couple of northeastern states that he had lost in the last election. So once again, an overwhelming majority of votes, both popular and electoral, for FDR. One of the big issues that FDR is facing after his re-election is the fact that he feels like he needs to make some changes to the Supreme Court. And the reason for that is because the Supreme Court is dominated by conservatives during this time, which are opposed to a lot of, both ideologically and politically, to a lot of FDR's New Deal programs. FDR can't really do a lot about this because Supreme Court justices are nominated for life or until they decide to leave. So he can't really fire anybody, and he's kind of stuck with what he's been given. The reason he's against them, or the reasons he feels it's a problem, is because there were 9 cases that came up for Supreme Court review dealing with New Deal programs, and 7 of them were approved. In other words, went against FDR. So he tries to come up with some solution for this. The solution he comes up with is what's called court packing, and the reason he does this is because FDR believes the court is hampering relief and reform that is necessary for the United States. So the proposal he makes is that he wants the Supreme Court raised from 9 justices to 15, and along with that, the president will be able to choose the new judges. Now, FDR misjudges the feelings of the American people on this, and the people pretty much come up against him. It effectively ends the New Deal and ends the programs that are associated with it. So this is going to wrap up a very, very, very general overview of the Great Depression and the New Deal. As I said earlier, a lot of these issues will be handled more in-depthly in class, but you need to know this for tests. So study this, and we will move forward to World War II and the next set of notes.